Um, we will be discussing today, and we're very, very fortunate to have Hussein Kesvani with us about his book, which was long listed for the Orwell Political Book Prize. I don't think I got the name quite right. And here it is. You may be able to see. Follow Me, Akhi, the online world of British Muslims, which having started reading it, I've read about half of it, is a fascinating insight into the online world in Britain today of Muslims. And as Hussein rightly points out right at the start of his book, it's we are so tied up really with looking at the physical world of mosques and some community centers, but the online world is deeply fascinating, and it goes far beyond just thinking about people being recruited online for ISIS or Daesh. Now, Hussein is a journalist. He's an editor, a producer based in London. He's the European editor of MEL Magazine, and he's written for BuzzFeed, The Guardian, New Statesman, Spectator, amongst others. And his book is available. I've put the link up in the chat for you from Hearst Publishers, and it is really a fantastic read. So I heartily recommend that. He's going to talk to us for about 20 to 30 minutes. Then we can open it up to question and answers. And if you wanted to submit any questions, please do so on the chat, and we will try to get through as many as we can. Anyhow, he's going to talk on the record, I think, if that's okay with him. And we look forward to hearing all about the book and its core themes. Hussein, thank you very, very much for being with us.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. Like there's way more people than I expected. And I haven't done like readings for a really long time. So I'm a little bit rusty. What I was thinking about doing, so when I did these events before, I would kind of just read a small section from the book, maybe like a couple of pages, and then kind of talk through the process. And because the book is sort of like a collection of reported stories and it involves like different people in different contexts, it's hard to like just pick one section. So here's kind of one of the introduction sections, or like the introduction section, which kind of sets up why I was doing this project in the first place. So I hope you can hear me. And yeah, okay. So this is from my introduction section. My call to war came at 3 a.m. via WhatsApp. A simple list of instructions, telephone numbers, and a list of what to bring on my journey. A warm jacket, an extra pair of socks, a hot water bottle. In the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful, the message began. You will not regret this, and I'm so much happier here than I was in Dar al-Kufr, the land of disbelief, so much more at peace. Follow me, Akhi, the message ended, addressing me as brother in Arabic, and I will help you make hijrah here. I had known Abu Antar for a little over a year when he asked me to join his holy war in Syria. It was in November 2015, and I was an ambitious young reporter, keen to make my mark in the cutthroat world of London media. And as one of the only Muslim reporters in a national newsroom, I had been assigned to cover stories about the British Muslim community, and in particular, their propensity for radicalization. For months, I'd been trying to secure an exclusive interview with a British Muslim who had opted to leave their privileged Western lifestyle in pursuit of jihad. I saw this as a key interview that would prove my abilities as a reporter and take me one step closer to my dream job as a political correspondent with a desk in Westminster Parliament. At the time, in a media cycle that had yet to be touched with Brexit and, I guess now, coronavirus, Donald Trump, and the rise of anti-globalism, the objects of national fear were Muslims, found in the estates of East London and in the suburbs of former industrial cities in the north. According to one British politician, thousands of Britons had fled to fight among Islamist militants in Iraq and Syria. Though official estimates at the time were much lower, at around about 500 people, the migration still provoked an anxiety that Muslims in Britain weren't loyal to their country of birth, and that they weren't able to integrate into society, and that Islam was not compatible with British values. I knew two Abu Antars, and both were defined by the internet. The first was the religious zealot. He was tall, lanky, a shadowy figure dressed in camouflage overalls, his face obscured by a black balaclava. His online profiles showed eyes so dark that they were close to black, and while little of his face was visible, you could make out the small ashy bags underneath his eyelids. He had changed his social media pictures frequently. Sometimes they would just be screenshots, passages of the Quran, or stock images of lions, a popular symbol among young jihadis in the so-called Islamic State, who styled themselves as noble warriors for Islam. Other times he uploaded pictures of himself. In some, he held combat knives or guns. In others, he sat in front of ISIS's black and white flag, holding up an index finger, symbolizing Tawheed, the oneness of God. This Abu Anta was exactly what you'd expect of an ISIS fighter. His social media posts were fixated on the importance of jihad, or on how Muslims in the West were living, quote, lazy, materialistic, living in a state of ignorance called jahiliyyah. This Abu Anta would use his online platform to argue against other Muslims and refute, quote, liberal scholars who he believed were deceiving Muslims from fulfilling their duties. When questioned about ISIS, he would post quotes from the hadiths that supported his and justified his actions, declaring that he was, quote, following the path of Ahlul Sunnah, those who adhere to the way of the Prophet Muhammad, a pure Islam that he believed wasn't tainted by cultural traditions or Western adaptations. It was a path that he had claimed he had been searching for his whole life, and one that he was willing to die for. The other Abu Anta I knew was a 24-year-old Londoner who had told me that he had once worked as a trader in the city's financial district and who passionately supported Arsenal Football Club. And as we got to know each other, he would tell me about his old life, riding glass elevators, wearing Armani, Gucci, and Prada suits. He spoke about client meetings on the rooftops of exclusive bars in Mayfair and Kensington, and how multi-million cash transfers were just part of his average working day. I had it all, but I didn't feel good, he wrote to me on Telegram, a direct messaging app. I always knew there was something missing. There were times when he would feel, quote, empty and isolated at his work desk. When he went to glitzy corporate events, he would sit at the bar, slightly tipsy, and feel, quote, a great amount of sadness. Abu Anta had pondered this deep-seated feeling of emptiness and concluded that, quote, there was more to life than just money and nightclubs. It seemed clear to me that Abu Anta had constructed this narrative of unhappiness followed by conviction and purpose to justify his decision to go to Raqqa to fight. He claimed that he had left, quote, a life of luxury to go fight for the sake of Allah. When I asked him about the specifics about traveling to Syria, he either refused to disclose details or circled around the questions. Who were his connections? How did he cross the border from Turkey? Did he travel on his own? He only responded by saying that he had traveled by Allah's guidance. Despite missing parts of his old life, and quote, more than once he had asked me to update him on football scores or complained that he missed Whisper chocolate bars, he needed to believe that he was fighting for a bigger cause, to establish a true Islamic caliphate. He had spoken about the caliphate since he was a teenager, but not at the mosque or the madrasa or to his family. Instead, these conversations took place in the dead of night on internet forums like the Student Room, a popular message board for British university students. Other times he would take it to darker places, more obscure communities like Totsi, 4chan, eBombs World, sites which could openly be rude and degrading and even post illegal material like computer hacking guides and PDFs of the anarchist cookbook. On these forums, he called himself Al-Sirat, and he would post long messages criticizing the British military involvement in Iraq, or quote, George Bush's war for oil, praising Al-Qaeda fighters and using as though simply resisting, quote, Western warmongers. To Abu Anta, the caliphate was the only way for the Muslim Ummah, the supposed global community of Muslims, to be united in fighting against Western imperialism. Other users of these forums laughed at him, but some downvoted his posts so his comments would be buried at the bottom of threads. Others reported him to community moderators, some of whom banned him from forums entirely for, quote, advocating harm and or violence. None of this deterred him or made him want to reconsider his beliefs. By the grace of Allah, I knew I was right, he told me. And I will end the reading there. Okay, so in terms of like general overview of the book, so this was a project that I was working on for 2 years, and it kind of began in theory on, so I used to work at BuzzFeed. I was a religion reporter, and my job was to report on kind of Muslim communities. They wanted someone who could tell the untold stories of British Muslims. And I always found that to be a very difficult task because I wasn't really sure what was meant by that. Number one, because as we all know, like the British Muslim community is a very kind of diverse community, and you know, they are separate by culture, religion, the culture, like religious sect, language, but also by class dimensions, you know, wealth, resources, assets, etc. So the idea of like being on top of the entire community was often very difficult, and as a result, I often clashed with my editors in terms of what I felt were important stories and what they felt were important stories. And more often than not, the fault lines would kind of be that I would find stories about like youth culture, internet culture, and kind of like identity stories to be far more important in terms of telling a story about young British Muslims than my editors, who were much more interested in looking at extremism and violence and terrorism, and basically like stuff that, you know, it's kind of like the shock jock things that you see in a lot of like mainstream newspapers. So I used to keep like a notebook on my desk, and every time I found one of these stories that I thought was really interesting but I knew would sort of never make it through the desk, I would kind of just jot it down in my notebook. And when I left BuzzFeed after a year and a bit, I took it with me, and I kind of was just like thinking about it a lot, because I left BuzzFeed kind of a little bit disillusioned with media. Also, I had a lot of questions about my own faith in terms of like, you know, did I feel like I didn't do a good job because I wasn't as connected to my religion as I thought that maybe I was, or maybe that I wasn't. So it was kind of it started this big, interesting journey into trying to kind of like reconcile with like faith and try to understand it within this context. And the context obviously being that being a British Muslim is like a sort of weird and disorientating experience because of, you know, not just because of like misconceptions, but also because of like global events. So lots of British Muslims who find that they have to like prove themselves as like loyal citizens, or prove themselves as you know, as integrated. And then at the same time, young British Muslims who have a lot of pressure from their families to abide by particular like cultural expectations or religious expectations. And I think whenever I was thinking about this, I always thought to myself that the common factor between lots of Muslims, one that like crosses cultures and crosses boundaries, is the fact that we all share like very similar online spaces. You know, we all kind of like exist on Facebook, or we all exist on Twitter, or we all exist on Instagram. You know, there are kind of more social platforms out there, but like the internet is a very small place. And it was like one of those places where, as a British Muslim, and I grew up in a suburb in Kent where there weren't really a lot of Muslims around. So most of my interactions with my religion and with other people of my religion that came from different sects or different environments came from the online world. A lot of my initial explorations into faith and faith identity came from the same forums as Abu Anta was on. So there was like this kind of sense of familiarity when I was speaking to him. And I kind of took that with me throughout the rest of the book. So in the book, I kind of speak to lots of different Muslims who come from very different backgrounds. You know, not all of them are South Asian. A lot of them are South Asian, but not all of them are South Asian. Some of them are like from Arab backgrounds. Some of them are from East African backgrounds. Some of them are converts. And I wanted to talk to them about how they experienced what they felt a British Muslim was, or like what they kind of felt being a Muslim living in, I guess, like 2018, 19, and now 20, what that was like. And I wanted to explore how the internet sort of like facilitated how they sort of navigated identities that were set for them, but also how they kind of built their own identities around that. So some of the stories that I was found really fascinating were just like really small stuff. In the opening chapter of my book, I speak to two young men who decide that they want to ditch Friday prayers at the mosque to hold their own Jummah prayers. And this is like a big controversial thing for a lot of Muslims, because for many, like Friday prayers is about being in a big community. And for lots of Muslims, like if you're not in a big kind of, if you're not praying within the community, then you're not really doing Friday prayers properly. So these guys took a very different approach. Their thing was, if I'm going to spend a section of my Friday listening to a lecture, I don't want to listen to a lecture about how to wash my hands properly, or you know, some sort of an action that they thought was mundane. They wanted to hear about kind of how they could implement their religious identity to you know, perform like particular acts of like social justice. And so as a result, they basically ditched the mosque and they decided that they would just be listening to YouTube videos. And not all those, and some of those YouTube videos weren't even Islamic lectures. They were just like lectures about you know, climate change or the environment, or about you know, prison reform and stuff like that. So they were kind of like fashioning they were taking like a religion that they were sort of born with and trying to kind of adapt it to their own kind of interests and the things that they were really passionate about. there are stories that I speak to a lot of women who fashion their own prayer spaces because the masjids that are in their local communities don't always accommodate them, or they don't kind of provide as much space as they would like for them. I spent a lot of time in the Muslim dating scene where, which was an interesting environment because it was the first time, marriage is like a very big element of Muslim culture, but it was the first time that like an app was at the forefront of this, and it had like changed like dating and marriage entirely. It kind of added this degree of like selection, and it took elders and generations out of the process, and like that kind of really disrupted the way that old things were done, and that had caused some controversy as well. And then on like the more serious side, I don't know, maybe some of you have read like the section in The Guardian where I kind of talk to an anti-Muslim troll, and I decide that I want to meet him. And the reason why I wanted to meet him was partly because I was like, I thought it would be kind of a fun gonzo piece, and I wasn't really like thinking about how much danger I was putting myself in. But the second thing was also I wanted to look at like the human face of trolling, and I wanted to kind of show that this isn't just a situation where it's like automated bots, or that it's kind of, that the cynicism behind these trolls are actually real people who are being influenced by the online world, and that it is seeping into the real world. And I have like kind of a lot to say about that on hindsight, especially considering that lots of kind of anti-Muslim rhetoric is being spread in relation to coronavirus, and it's kind of interesting to see the similar types of vitriol be manifest in different ways. And I think and there's like various other stories that maybe like you guys will probably have more of an idea of than I have, which kind of just goes to show how long it has been since I've looked at my own book. So I'll kind of like give some concluding thoughts before I like answer the questions in the chat and everything. I think that what I was trying to do with this was to expand the conversation around British Muslims to not just be one where it's like we accept that there is a diversity of British Muslims, but I really wanted to look at it, and I really wanted to center young people in the book, because I felt that for so many kind of ethnographic or anthropological studies of British Muslim culture, they kind of operated in the same way. They went to kind of like hotspots in the UK where there were big Muslim communities, like in Bradford and Leeds and East London and stuff like that. They would go to the mosque, they would talk to like the community leaders, and they would say, this is kind of what British Muslim culture is like. And what I wanted to show is actually, this is one aspect, and it is an important aspect. But it was also, sorry, what was I going to say? Yeah, I wanted to show that like youth culture was sort of implementing very different priorities and objectives, and eventually like the notion of a British Muslim identity is going to be very different in like the next kind of decade than it is now. So I'll end it there, because I sort of feel like I'm covering a lot of territory very fast, and maybe with like more specific questions I can kind of give more specific answers.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Hussein, for kicking that off. I think that really opened it up. I mean, if I can just sort of start a question of my own, perhaps, just a little bit, how you would summarize the journey really of online Muslims in terms of the chronology. I mean, what it was like. I mean, it's all happened so fast, of course. I mean, all these mega social media networks, Facebook, Twitter, are still quite recent historically. I mean, if you were to go back 15 years ago, and people were on MySpace, and for those who can recall, I mean, how have you seen it sort of change, and people's attitudes, in the British Muslim communities changed to this online space?
I think they've become like more open to it. Again, like I think that I was like focusing on a very small, so this isn't like a study of like Muslims as a whole. I really just wanted to like look at young people. I wanted to look at millennials, and I wanted to look at like Gen Z and stuff like that. So I think for like, this is a generation that has grown up using the internet, and in some ways like out of a necessity, but also in the same way that like as our, this is like the perfect example of this, as our lives have kind of been fully integrated into an online space, I wanted to look at how an identity that lots of people were born with, how it kind of adapts to an online space. And I think that, I give some of the examples in the book. So whether that's, doing remote Jummah prayers or, again, with like marriage apps where, we now have like marriage apps where more practicing people can kind of integrate like walis, or, people who are like guardians who like look over a particular like marriage proposal. Like that was something that a lot of the early Muslim marriage apps like didn't really have. So in some ways, like with, I guess what I'm trying to say is that with like some technological advancements, it's become easier to like integrate the various diverse approaches to like faith. I think in other ways, just as like we've become more accustomed to using social media as a means of communication, i.e. like, people like WhatsApp and, Facebook message and stuff. And that's like a very normal thing in a way it wasn't like 5 years ago. Young religious people are going to do the same thing. So in many ways, it mirrors a lot of like what society's doing. And I guess like that was also one of the points that like religion and religious identity isn't like this obscure and abstract thing that doesn't belong on secular platforms. It kind of grows and adapts in the same way that other aspects of culture has as well.
Thank you very much. Now we've got some questions coming through on the chat. So please, everybody, if you've got some questions, do put them, etc., in the usual polite fashion. Sahar Sawa, Sahar, how are you? You with us? Give her a second to come online. If not, I'll ask the question.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Hi, Sahar. You have a question about BuzzFeed.
Yes, I was wondering, Hussein, you talked a bit about your frustrations in the newsroom there during your time at BuzzFeed. Since you've left, do you think that they're making moves in the right direction in terms of their British Muslim reporting?
I don't really like read a lot of it these days. So I'm not really sure like what's going on there. But I know that like the person who like took over that beat when I left, Aisha Ghani, is like a very, very talented reporter, and she did some really excellent work. And she was also able to kind of like push back from the priorities of like the editorial priorities of like extremism and terrorism and stuff. And she was really able to kind of tell stories definitely about like more like working class Muslims. So from what I read of her stuff, it was very good. And I think she's doing like really good work in Al Jazeera as well. I think that like overall, this is more of a question about like how many Muslims are in the newsroom, but also how many Muslims from, marginal backgrounds kind of tell those stories. I definitely think that like, while I was able to tell some stories, like, I also wasn't in a position to tell others. And one of the things that I felt very uncomfortable about sometimes was like parachuting into communities that I didn't really have like prior relationships with, and not having the time to really integrate and like build those friendships and build that trust. So I'm hoping that they do it now, but I haven't really checked. I would say that like British media on a whole, like not amazing, but there's definitely more organizations, and also like there's definitely like a lot more freelancers who are doing really, really good work and are worth paying attention to.
Thank you very much for that. Now we've got a couple of questions, one that follows on from that one from Sahar, from Bernie Howley. Bernie, you with us? Yeah, you're muted, I'm afraid. I'll unmute you. There we are.
Am I unmuted? Thank
yes,
you. Okay, thank you very much. It's really interesting listening to how you write and what you write. But I wondered at that time when you were at BuzzFeed, the identity of the editors in terms of their religion background and everything else, were you kind of brought in to provide that which was missing?
Yeah, kind of. And it was weird because like as far as I was, all my editors were basically secular and non-practicing Christians. They knew very little about like religion in general. So when I came on as a religion reporter, I was very excited to kind of talk about and investigate religion, including religious communities that like I didn't really know a lot about. It eventually became a job which was like, oh, we would prefer you to kind of be looking at these extremism stories because these other kind of Muslim reporters are doing this, or like these other reporters are doing the same thing and getting all these ISIS scoops. So like, why aren't you able to do that? And I don't know, it became a very disorientating experience, and one that, I mean, I learned a lot from there, and I still keep in touch with a lot of my kind of very good friends and mentors come from BuzzFeed as well. So I have no kind of like, you know, bad thoughts about them. I just think that like when you develop a religion beat, which is a really like absent concept in this country anyway, I think it's really only like 1 or 2 newspapers that have like dedicated religion correspondents. But I have a very good friend in LA called Joeed Kaleem, who is a very good religion reporter at the LA Times. And his thing was always that if you're going to do a religion beat, like more priority should be spent like actually spending time within these communities and like having meals with them and like talking to them about, you know, and taking what they think seriously. So it was where like the parachuting, getting scoops approach thing wasn't something that really sat well with me. And when I was doing this book, it was kind of, you know, I spent 2 years working on this, and I wish that I could have spent longer. But one thing I really appreciated was the fact that with a lot of these people that I spent time with, I spent, you know, days, weeks, like just hanging out with them, speaking to them on the phone and everything. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It kind of leads on to the second part of my question, which was how did you define your own boundaries in terms of trust and confidentiality? Because I think when you build relationships, you're trying to write about and with people, I think that's a really hard thing to do.
That's a good question. And actually the first time I've really been asked this. So I can tell you more about like the boundaries that other people set for me. So when I was like I really wanted to speak to people who hadn't really been treated well in mainstream press, but also hadn't really been approached in mainstream press. So they would have a natural suspicion of it. And I spent like a long time. I spent like months. I think I spent like a good year with one person, just like trying to tell them this is the project I'm trying to do. And like, you know, I'm not, you know, and kind of laying out every question I was going to ask them, almost to the point where like they could not have been more prepared for anything I would have asked, because I had sent them both like a list and follow-ups and everything. So I think that like it was more of a time thing, and it was more like, look, I wouldn't be like messaging you for this long if this was just a case of like me parachuting for a story and then jumping out of your life. So with them, it was very much like I was taking it from a position of, look, they don't need to trust me, they don't need to really like me, because, you know, I can understand why they would be very hostile towards my industry, or like the industry that I'm in. And I think I just worked on it on that basis. But also, again, like none of them owed me their stories. There were a lot of people who I approached who just flat out said like, I'm not speaking to you, leave me alone, etc. And I just had to respect that, right? So like, when I look at this book, I'm like, I think I did the best I could with what I had, but there were so many more interesting stories that I wish I could have told, but I just didn't have access to. In terms of myself, like, I don't know, I think in some degrees I was very reckless. Like when I went to go meet that troll, I was just like, oh, this is going to be really funny. And when I was coming back, it was only then when I realized that, oh, that could have gone in a really different and much more dangerous way. And I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. So if something happened to me, like, my parents wouldn't have been able to find out or anything, and that was like a really irresponsible like thing to do. The one thing that I did do that I learned from BuzzFeed actually was about like keeping security details on lock. So I used like burner phones. I had like various like email addresses that I would use to kind of make sure that no one was like tracing my home email address. So I did like very basic security measures, and I also had like friends who were like looking out for me whenever I would go out to do stories. So if there was something that happened, like I could just call one of them. So my boundaries are more to do with safety than anything else. Again, I don't know if that answers your question, and if it doesn't, I'm sorry.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernie. Now, we have also a question from Mohammed Amin. Mohammed. He's trying to unmute himself. There we go.
I think I'm now unmuted.
You're
I'm
fine.
always conscious of the fact that Muslim communities are not homogeneous, and in particular the smaller Muslim communities like the Ismailis, the Ahmadiyyas, are much more organized in terms of how people in those communities live in a collective way, whereas Sunni Muslims, I think, can often feel sort of lost if they can't connect with or relate to the elders at their local mosque, or they may not feel any particular affinity to any particular part of sort of the Muslim organizations. Did you find any differences in your work between these different religious groups in terms of their attitudes, experiences on the internet, etc.?
So in my book, I do so there's a section where I spent some time with some of the Ahmadi community, and I was really looking at how they were using their online resources, which they invested a good amount of time and money in to really leverage themselves and to really promote themselves. I definitely noticed differences, but in the book I didn't really focus on the theological differences or kind of the lived community differences, because my remit was very small. It was literally just to talk about online culture and how people interacted with the online space. So I did speak about things along the lines of, well, when you're a minority community, if you're a Shia, or if you're or even if you're from kind of a subsect within a main sect, you do get, you will receive hostility online. And how do you report that? Reporting that, for example, is very difficult. How do you classify, trolling in the context of religious or theological disputes where there isn't kind of clear guidelines as to what classifies as abuse and what doesn't on a very secular platform like Twitter or Facebook or something like that. So I definitely noticed those differences. I think when I was telling the stories though, I didn't necessarily want to focus on those differences because I sort of felt that they were not necessarily, when I was writing and researching the book, I really just wanted to look at how does this kind of network system influence the way that people see themselves and interact with themselves, and interact with their own identity. So it wasn't necessarily just about hostility, and I didn't really focus so much on the hostile component. But yeah,
that wasn't really the thrust of my question. I was more interested in the lived experiences of young Ismaili Muslims, young Ahmadiyya Muslims compared with young Sunni Muslims, to see whether you saw any different trends.
Okay, so I didn't actually do any stuff on the Ismailis, sadly. Again, so I can only really talk about the research that I did with the Ahmadiyyas. And I would kind of say I didn't explicitly look at those contrasts. I think when you read if you read the section that I wrote on the Ahmadiyyas, and I can send it to you if you want, what I basically showed was the reason, here are the ways that they use their online infrastructure to talk about their legitimacy, or talk about why they're kind of, why they kind of are legitimate Muslims, because they're responding to they're responding to this broader claim, but they're not. And in some ways it's how do you I look at how they fashion their own spaces, which provide both a safe space for them to actualize that identity, but at the same time without kind of saying that they are in direct contrast with this group, because I just didn't kind of see that. So I don't know if that makes sense, but again, I think also because I was focusing so much on the individuals, the individual characters, I was kind of just looking at them as kind of holistic characters. So I didn't want to present a character as his entire motivation is based on proving that he's an authentic Muslim to various Sunni or Shia interpretations, or vice versa.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Now we have a question from Bushra. Bushra, are you with us?
I am. Hello.
Hi.
Sorry, there's some feedback. So my question is, how do you make sure, as a British Muslim, whatever part of your identity that you subscribe to, how do you make sure that you don't reproduce those same reductive narratives? Because sure. I think despite the trolling, there was a legitimate question in kind of critiquing this book as a piece of anthropology. So are you studying Muslims, or are you simply just is it something that is related to your own identity? Is it just a critique?
It's not a critique. So that's the first thing. This isn't a critique of Muslims or Muslim culture or anything like that. I would also say, even though this is a book that's kind of classified as theology, I would actually say that this is more of a book about internet culture. So what I wanted to look at was how a religious identity that, and again, this is also a reaction to a lot of the books that do take an anthropological approach, and to which I would kind of have like some issues with in terms of their how they approach things. So one book that I was thinking about when I was writing this was a book called Old Britannia by James Ferguson, who is a established foreign reporter, and he wrote this book which looked at the British Muslim community in a very like scientific anthropological way. Again, he would go to he would go to these like masjids in various areas where there were lots of like South Asian Muslims, and he would basically describe what was going on, and he would talk to like, you know, these community leaders, and that would be like how the British Muslims were defined. And me and my editor, who is also a practicing Muslim woman, we were very adamant that we didn't want to take that approach. But at the same time, we also wanted to explain how internet culture was working in a space that is often reduced to being, you know, reduced to like that anthropological approach. We wanted to like show that like, look, we talk a lot about there being like a diversity of British Muslims, and that British Muslims have different opinions, and they have like different observations about the world, and they practice in different ways. And, you know, and that's what I wanted to show through like individuals who I felt were like using the internet in interesting ways. So in order to like answer your question, which I'm reading on the chat about like, am I curating this for a white audience? It was never like again, I think that's like a subjective question. I know I've had like some critiques which are like, you know, you're just explaining this for like white people, you know, you haven't really written this for like Muslims or anything. I really wanted to write it for Muslims. And I know that like there have been the feedback that I've really appreciated have come from young Muslims who aren't really represented in books and like, you know, published work that already exists, who have kind of been like, you know, this is like a much better way of explaining like how my identity isn't like the entire part of me, but just like one aspect. Again, I think it's like it's a big question that I think about a lot, and it makes me anxious because when the book came out, like the people who reviewed it were like white people, right? And like the Orwell Foundation is filled with white people, and you know, and all the reviews that like my parents are really proud of are all done by white people, right? I don't know whether that's like something that I could have avoided, something that, but I also know that like one of the first things that my publishers and I did was like, rather than send the books out to these big review houses and newspapers, we sent them to masjids. Like I sent them to a bunch of masjids, and I gave talks at those masjids because that was the thing that I wanted to do. And ultimately my mission was to say that, you know, look, I come from a practicing Muslim family, right? I was training to become a Shia Maulana for like a few years. You know, Islam is like a really important religion. It's a really important aspect of my identity, but it's also a really important aspect of like who I am. So I wanted to write this in a really honest way, which kind of showed that like, this was how I kind of came to terms with my faith and the conflicts I had with my family and my community, and all at the same time while holding on to this religion that meant so much to me and means far more than like any type of award or, you know, nice review from like a mainstream newspaper. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's kind of like an answer, or if you have like any follow-up questions to that, but it is something that I think about a lot.
Yeah, I've got a couple of follow-up questions to that, because I just wonder, does it beg the question, you know, because you mentioned representation a couple of times, is it about how we represent, or is the question, why do we need representation? Because, you know, like this internet culture, you know, I'm a millennial, I'm on Twitter a lot, I'm on Instagram a lot. You see these pockets of amazing like spaces of Muslims on all spectrums, you know, queer Muslims, Muslims who are more observing, Muslims who aren't, whatever. And the main language is through meme culture, and it represents all aspects of our identity, our lived experiences. But do we need that studied? Do we need to tell everyone, hey, by the way, this is here, you know, here are what Muslims are like as well, you know? Do we need to be represented in that sense?
I mean, I wouldn't say that my book is like really about representation, right? I think representation is like an aspect of it, but like the intention isn't representation. It isn't to kind of, you know, it isn't to kind of like prove to other people, like Western people, that, oh, we're, you know, we're like really good and moderate and, you know, stuff like that. If that was the case, like I wouldn't have added like sections. I wouldn't have like gone to speak to people who have who openly said, but like, I don't give a shit what, like, you know, I don't give a shit like what these people think about me. You know, I wouldn't have like gone to go like meet a troll who, like, regardless of the book that I put out, which has lots of really amazing Muslims who are doing really amazing things, is still like, you know, is still probably going to troll me and give me like the same amount of abuse and give the same amount of other people abuse, right? I think also this was a very personal exercise. I am a practicing Muslim person who had the experience of like having to navigate multiple spaces, had the experience of like being told on the one hand, but like, you're not really Muslim enough. You know, and, you know, also like, why don't you know enough people that are joining ISIS? Like, you know, that was like a legitimate question that like one of my editors asked me. And one of the reasons why like I quit my job, right? So this came from like a very personal space. And I also just felt that, look, as a young person who spent pretty much all their formative years on the internet and whose kind of main religious influences didn't come from their communities, they didn't come from their families, but came from like quite bizarre and dangerous people online. And then having to kind of like reconcile that like, even though I and many people in my generation are in like a better place now, and that we can like understand our faith in terms that are much more personalized and much more like, you know, down to earth, that, you know, going, you know, that was like a formative aspect of our youth, and that doesn't go away, and that is a really important aspect of our life. And as we kind of talk about the harms of social media, or like the kind of dangers of social media, that this is a conversation that's worth having. And again, like, I always say to people that this is a book about internet culture. You can apply these things to other communities, other environments, and you'll probably like have very similar findings. You can apply this to like young white people, right? And like, there'll be very similar stories. But, you know, and I don't think anyone would make the argument about like, well, okay, do you need to publish this book, you know, to show that, you know, actually most white people are good, or like most of this group are good? You know, I'm not here to like really prove anything or to like tell people this is what Muslims are like. Like, that's not my job anymore. And to be honest, I never wanted it to be my job. This is just like, this was just a very personal kind of exercise into something that I was interested in and I felt would be useful, particularly for the communities that I grew up in. And I mean, I hope that like some people do find value in it, but, you know, if they don't, then like, there's not really much I can do about that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hussein. Now, I'm going to read out the next question from Jacqueline Fuller because her microphone isn't working very well, so she asked me to. And the question she has for you, Hussein, is, how do you see the notion of British Muslim identity changing in the near term? And the second one was, what role has the internet played in connecting Muslim communities around the world?
Okay. So for the first one, I don't really know. I think that like, even though the book has only been out for about even like less than a year, it's kind of very fast becoming outdated. So one section that was never in the book was like TikTok. TikTok is a huge app that like, I know so many young Muslims around the world, in particular like in India and Pakistan and stuff, they're like obsessed by. And there's like a whole different language and taxonomy and, you know, whole different type of internet discourse around TikTok. So, and that could like change, you know, I know that's like one app, but I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that like, culture like changes as platforms changes as well, because the whole goal of like platforms is to kind of connect more people at a faster rate. You know, Chris made, you made the question about like, what's the difference between like MySpace and Twitter, for example. You know, a lot of it is to do with functionality. A lot of it is to do with the fact that with MySpace, you know, from my experience of it, I could connect with people within my immediate circle and maybe a few circles outside of it. But with Twitter, I can connect with people around the world, and I can do it in like a record amount of time. You know, so many of like the stories that I investigated, but also if you want to go back to like the extremism stories, so much of like the origins of that came from the fact that you could connect with someone relatively quickly from the other side of the world and also be able to talk to them like much more easily through like faster instant messages and stuff like that. So I don't know what is going to happen as these platforms become faster or they become more integrated or the language changes. I do say in the book that like, I don't think that it's going to be like a replacement for stuff. So like and this is like a very interesting question for now, but I don't think, for example, that like the internet will replace the function of the masjid, or that it will kind of replace the need for the need or the value that young people have for like their local communities or their families and stuff like that. So I think for like the very base level things will be there, but you know, the integration of technology might mean that like religious education, for example, might be much easier to spread around. It might be much easier to have like conversations that take place outside of a masjid. It might mean that like different types of interactions between, you know, young Muslims, you know, they might be facilitated in different ways. So I think that's like very much like up for, you know, you can speculate on that for a long time. The second part of the question was about connecting around the world, right?
Yes, that was it.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, the fact that you can, you know, the fact that like I was able to connect with people, you know, so one of my chapters that I did about, you know, gaming, for example, I found this gaming community because I was able to contact someone who lived in Dubai, and he was part of like a Discord group, Discord being an instant messenger group that's very popular in the gaming community. He was able to find this group. He moderated this group that was filled with like Muslims around, you know, from around the world. And they were all just like, they were all connected by the fact that they all love playing Overwatch, which is again, like a very popular online game. And I think you can find examples of that in, you know, different spaces. And again, I think this is a question to do with technology, and it's to do with the fact that the internet as it currently exists, we all kind of use pretty much the same platforms. Like Zoom is a good example of this, right? Everyone around the world is using Zoom. You know, they're not really using Skype, they're not really using Hangouts. So many, like loads of people around the world are just using Zoom, to the point where like Zoom have had to like actually increase the physical capacity of their servers to manage all those people. Facebook is a very similar place, like, you know, a global network, but one which is like relatively small considering the fact that like it's just one platform and it has like its particular limitations. Twitter being the same thing as well. So I think that like as we kind of congregate on a small number of platforms, the interactions between people, not just around the world, but from different communities and classes and denominations and sects, that's going to continue to expand. And that might be a good thing. It might be a bad thing as well. I know, like, you know, for a lot of people who are very active in like, you know, free internet activism, the idea that like one company can own multiple major platforms is a really dangerous precedent to set for internet freedom and, you know, communicative freedom as well. So that's not just, you know, that's, I guess that's more of an observation rather than like that's a good thing or a bad thing or like any type of judgment.
Thank you very much for that. Now we have a question which I think opens up a new topic for us, from Lerka Osman. Lerka, are you with us? Have I pronounced your name right?
Yeah, it's Leica. Thank you.
Leica, sorry. Hi.
Hi. I was just wondering if you found any distinguishable trends of how Muslim women experience the internet, as I noticed there wasn't a specific section on gender in your book.
There was like a section on, I don't know whether it was about women, but I know like there wasn't a specific section on gender in the final draft, because, and I remember this, I had tried to do like a bunch of like theory, and my editor crossed it all out and was like, you do not know any theory, just stick with the reporting. I did notice that there were like definite, obvious gendered disparities between, at least like from my observations. So you know, some of the most obvious ones were Muslim women who were kind of forming their own kind of safe networks and safe spaces to you know, to congregate and practice, because they had felt that the masjids that their family members or their like husbands would go to weren't like necessarily accommodating the types of spaces that they needed. So sometimes it would be like, oh, we don't have, you know, not enough space to pray. But in other spaces it would be, well, we have space to pray, but we don't really have spaces to kind of hold like meetings or hold like, you know, talks and lectures and stuff like that. So they were using they were using open networks like WhatsApp and everything, and like private Facebook groups in order to kind of facilitate and host those meetings. I think because the book was like looking so much at individuals, there isn't kind of, I don't point out this kind of these like clear disparities of like men have it easier than women or women have it easier than men, I think that would have like required much more like theory than I was kind of necessarily capable of. But the main thing that I had found was that like for women in particular, like there was one of the things that I found very interesting was that women were often having to be very, very careful in terms of how they express themselves, even with like very kind of small mundane things when it came to like theological points and stuff, because so many of them basically had told me that like, well, if I get something wrong or if I say something that like people disapprove of, I'm just going to have like lots of men in my mentions or lots of men in like my message, my inbox telling me, you know, that I don't have a place to kind of like say this thing, or I don't have the right to say this thing, or I shouldn't be in like those particular spaces. So just the very nature of like them having to kind of create private and secure spaces. You know, there was like one woman that I spoke to who like was really practicing and also really active online, but she stayed on a platform called Tumblr. And like the reason why she stayed on Tumblr was because she said like it was so complicated for most people that like she didn't expect many men to be on there. So it was like almost like a very safe space for her to like be able to explore that aspect of her religious identity without having to kind of like confront all the extra stuff that came with like being on a mainstream platform. Yeah, and I don't know, I think like observations like sort of littered throughout the book. There isn't like a clear section on gender, but I think that was more on like my editor's behest than like mine.
Could I just ask, did you have any insight into what those private groups that you're mentioning that women are using, like what was going on there? Did you have anyone?
They let me in some of them. In many ways, it was very normal. It was just like organizing prayer times or deciding what they wanted to talk about. And most of it would be like women's issues. It would be to do with like, you know, stuff to do with like marriage or stuff to do with divorce or, you know, things to do with like sexual health or a lot of stuff to do with mental health, actually. Mental health was a really big and common topic in those groups. And they were more like support spaces than anything else because, you know, for so many of these women, they just didn't know like, you know, where can I go to kind of like talk about, you know, my mental well-being, or you know, what types of resources can I use, how can I do it in a way where I'm not getting like extra family members involved. So but in other ways it was just it was like extremely normal. It was like in all the other Islamic groups where, you know, you have people sharing, you know, YouTube videos of like hadiths or Quran readings and stuff like that. There was a lot of that there as well. So I didn't notice like these big disparities. I just noticed like the small ones, but it was more the idea that like having these private spaces indicated something about like the need for kind of privacy and the need for security in those types of environments, which I guess like the secular online world could kind of offer.
Thank you very much, Laika. Now we have a question from Amy Gawish. Amy, are you still with us?
Yes, hi. You're the first person who's ever pronounced my surname correctly.
Glad I got one right.
Hi. So my question is basically about, so I reverted to Islam in December. And so I've grown up in a sort of white middle class Christian family. And so obviously I don't have this sort of, you know, the same network that a lot of Muslim people do. And I mean, I'm really lucky that I did find a mosque that has a really wonderful, you know, community and things, but it's quite far from me. So sometimes when I'm trying to find sort of information about, you know, the best way I can practice and things, is obviously the internet, but where information can be so because you don't always know what to trust. You know, I don't know how that kind of affects how people practice. You know, how is it difficult? You know, is it difficult to decipher what's right from wrong? Or yeah, sorry, I'm not quite sure what my question is. It's just sort of me also trying to find my way around the internet and trying to find things as a best way to practice.
Yeah, I think it's like a very common, it's a very common, like, from what you told me, like that's a very common thing among even like people who aren't like reverts, is, you know, or I think also just the degree of like selectivity, maybe like that's not the right word, but like from the people that I interviewed, a lot of them were kind of trying to figure out how they could be comfortable with like aspects of faith that they'd grown up with, but also, you know, the ability to kind of decide or design like how they would interact with elements of their faith. And because so much of the online world offered like a choice, or they offered like various choices or various kind of pathways to quote unquote authenticity, you know, they were presented with those difficulties as well in terms of like, well, what do I do and where do I go, and you know, what kind of works for me. And I guess that's more like a work in progress than anything else, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just sort of, yeah, it's just finding what works, and but also trying to find that the misinformation from the real information. And yeah, no, it's helpful just to kind of also, because I think reverts are sometimes also, there isn't a great amount of information out there to feel part of a community. You know, it can be a bit intimidating trying to join a new community. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Excellent, thank you very much, Amy. I think we've run out of questions there, but I had a couple of questions, at least one, just to perhaps finish up. I mean, you mentioned the counter to all of this a little bit, you know, the Islamophobic part of the world online, and particularly some of the trolls and the far right you met. I mean, how do you see Muslims online responding to all of that? Have they been successful? Are they? How do you see them handling the quite substantive amount of hatred that is dished out?
That's a good question, because I think, again, there's not a thing of like how have Muslims done it, because, you know, the type of vitriol and the type of abuse is different. And again, I think to answer like a very early question that I forgot to say, like there's like a lot of gendered abuse that happens in like an Islamophobic context, i.e. if you're a Muslim woman, you're much more likely to like be a victim of Islamophobic abuse, both online and offline. The types of abuse are like very different. So like with women, you know, a lot of the abuse is, you know, I mean, just to put it very bluntly, like it's a lot more graphic and a lot more like violent than it would be towards men. So like even the worst forms of abuse that I've ever really gotten haven't been anywhere close to friends and colleagues of mine who are Muslim women, like hijabi Muslim women in particular, and the type of stuff that they've received. So I think it's important to like set that out for, like foremost, that this is definitely not the same for everyone, and not everyone can kind of quote unquote handle it in a way that like people are often kind of told to or sort of lectured towards. I think that like groups like the Muslim Council of Britain, for example, have been very good at like tracking and doing a lot of like the data work that comes with Islamophobic abuse, and that's kind of informed a lot of interesting reports, and those reports have like then influence how platforms like respond to Islamophobic abuse, which is like far from perfect, but is definitely a lot better than it was a couple of years ago, at least on the very instance that like they can recognize that like this is like a form of abuse that isn't, you know, that is worth paying attention to and is worth kind of curbing on. I think that like just in, you know, I mean, my general opinion is that like, you know, Muslims do need more support from platforms in order to kind of like identify these types of abuses, and also to protect them from it, because I still think that a lot of platforms take on this idea that, you know, trolling is harmless, and if you just, you know, you should just like log off, or like, you know, take a break for a few hours and it'll be fine. And it's like, no, you know, the psychological impact of that kind of abuse is very, very intense. So I mean, my answer very shortly is like, I think they're doing like the best that they can. I think that like for a lot of Muslims, there feels a lot of pressure to like, you know, prove themselves in multiple ways, and prove themselves as like upright citizens and, you know, people who are like loyal to the country and stuff like that. So really the onus is on platforms rather than them.
Okay, well, I think we've run out of time now. So thank you, Hussein, very much for
Thank you so
joining
much.
us today. It really was, fascinating. It's an extremely important topic, what is going on in the way, and to look at in all its different facets, the way in which the online world is changing, not just how British Muslims are reacting to it, but others as well. I think we are learning about it in a fast, changing environment. As you say, the platforms change and everything and what people get out of it. And even, of course, during this horrible pandemic. But it's been absolutely fascinating. The book is all there on the link. You can get it from Hearst Publishers. You can get it as a paperback or as an ebook if you prefer. Thank you very much, Hussein. Thank you for everybody for joining us. We have a meeting tomorrow on Libya. The details are on our website. We have 3 speakers dealing with that tomorrow. I think at is it 2 o'clock, Joe? So please come along. It promises to be very interesting as well. That just leaves me to say thank you for everybody for joining, for all your questions and engagement. It's great. We look forward to seeing you at future events. Take care and please stay safe.